you ready to take your watercolors up to the next level? I'm Matthew Bird, and this is Lessons in Realistic Watercolor, Still Life. Welcome. I'm excited to be doing this with you all, and it's a little bit different format than I'm sure any of us are used to, doing both pre-recorded and live sessions, but I think it's going to work out really well. And I would suggest that as I go through lessons, if you keep pencil and paper, or just make any notes along the way. If you want clarification or if you have questions, when we meet together on Zoom, we can go over that kind of stuff. Because I am used to having interaction while I'm working, so this will be a little bit different, but we'll kind of do follow-up when we meet live. So you all have the image that we will eventually be working towards. I set up a small basic still life in my studio and photographed it. So you should have the photo and the line drawing. This is what we'll be working towards. It's pretty simple. It should offer us good lessons on building up textures, creating form and volume, understanding value, color relationships. So I'm excited. I think it's going to work out really well. Behind me is another similar still life that I did for another class, so you can see how that works, how it looks when it's all done and framed up. Even the simple basic stuff that we learn from can really end up being a nice little painting in the end. So we have that to look forward to. But that being said, I would encourage you all not to approach these lessons or the painting that you're working on as some, really special, precious thing, because I think you'll kind of hinder your learning. It's a time to learn these skills, to mess up. It's okay. And as you take what you learn after this class, that's when you're really going to start. That's like when the real class begins, when you take what you learn and you execute it in the future. So if you're making mistakes or if things don't come out the way you want them to while we're doing this, it's okay. That's all part of it. Trying to cling on to something being perfect, is gonna hinder your progress, I think. So I am sure you are all anxious to really get into the painting part of this, and I am too, but we'll get there. First, we're going to kind of go over some of the basics. I want to talk a little bit about my setup and kind of get some foundational stuff going. This is my paper. I'm working on a Fabriano 300 pound. It's cut from a larger sheet. If you're used to working on a watercolor block or stretching your paper and putting it down on a board, that's totally fine. That's not generally the way I work, but feel free to work whatever you're used to doing. I don't really know anyone else that does it the way I do it. So what I have here is an old beat up terry cloth towel. And I like to spread this out and work with my watercolor paper right on the towel. So like I said, it's a little bit untraditional. There are multiple ways of doing things to get great results. I think that's one of the first things that I would want to try to convey to you all. I'm going to be teaching you the way I do stuff. There's definitely other ways that you can work, and I'll try to address some of those as we go along. But there's lots of great methods. There are definitely wrong ways to do things, and I'll try to touch on some of that. But there's many different avenues to get the realistic results that I go for. The reason I am doing this sheet on a towel like this, and you can see from some of my past paintings, or you can see the outline of the sheets, I like to be able to just brush right off the paper and not have to worry about messing up my table or leaving beads of water. If I have this taped to a board, there'll often be beads of water that are on the tape. And what happens with that sometimes is if you're not careful to soak that up, they'll seep back onto your sheet and create backwashes or blooms, which can be cool, but generally not what you're wanting in a clean wash. So this is one way that I kind of address that, so it's not, so that doesn't happen. I typically will work flat most of the time. I will sometimes work vertical. It kind of depends on what I'm painting. But for this, we're going to be working flat. And I have a light start of my drawing here. And I want to just touch on the importance of getting a good drawing. Watercolor is not a very forgiving medium, especially when you're working very realistically like this. So being able to draw well is crucial. If you have a good drawing, you're going to have a pretty good painting. If you have a bad drawing, it's really almost impossible to get a good painting out of that. The drawing is going to be the bones that we're going to, or I call it like a map. All my marks are kind of mapping out how I'm going to process each step so I know what I'm going to do. And with watercolor, it really is planning out ahead. Sort of like chess, you got to think multiple moves ahead. What are you going to do first, second, third, and how's that going to affect everything that goes later or comes before? So having a good drawing is really important. This is a pretty basic image, so just getting the rough shapes down, that's all you need to worry about. Whether you just freestyle it and just draw straight from the photo. You can use a grid system. You can use transfer paper and just draw the photo onto the, transfer paper goes underneath and you can convert your lines onto the paper that way. You could project it. There's lots of different ways to do it. Since this is not a drawing class, this is a painting class, I'm not going to go into all that too much, but I did just want to talk about the importance of the drawing because it is crucial when you're working in a highly realistic style. And the reason why it's crucial for watercolor more so than other mediums is because watercolor, it's like a subtractive process. Oil painting, for example, you can lay it in, you can kind of carve out your shapes, you can paint in with white, you can scrape stuff out. It's very versatile. With watercolor, it can be, I don't use white paint that often. It's transparent, so it's hard to just paint over something once you already have something down. There's things you can do like lifting or using a magic eraser, some tricks, but generally the more you have your painting planned out ahead of time, the better off you're going to be. I often kind of tell people that don't really understand the difference that watercolor, if you were to talk about painting as if it were sculpture, watercolor is kind of like sculpting marble. And oil painting is kind of like sculpting with clay. So if you're sculpting with clay and you You know, you take off too much of a head or too much of a nose. With clay, you can get a little bit more clay, put it back on there, you know, you can add it on and kind of fix it. If you're doing that with marble and you chisel off too much of a nose, you can't just put marble when you glue it back on. It's not the same. So watercolor, it's kind of like that. Once I take away the white of this paper, you know, you're not going back to that pure white. And that's why we'll get to using masking fluid, masking tape, different sorts of tricks, wax resist, to preserve that white, because once that's gone, it's really hard to get it back. So that's kind of how I describe people who don't understand painting and relate it to sculpture. I don't know if that makes sense. Once you have your drawing in place, you sort of have to plan out in your head what you're going to do and how you're going to paint, and use your drawing as a map. That's kind of your guide. There's two general approaches that I use. I will look at my subject. If it's super complex, if it's one of my, you know, really challenging big pieces, you know, you got hours already invested just in getting the drawing done. I don't want to screw something up and then have to start over. So one approach that I will take, which is what I did with this one, is to pick out the section or sections of the painting that I'm most concerned about, that I think I'm not really sure how I'm going to do this, and do those first. And that way, if I do mess it up, then, you know, it's not like I've got the whole painting done and then I have to start over. I can just, in this case, it was this mint julep cup. The silver, the water droplets reflecting the flower in here. I was like, oh, that's going to be challenging. I've painted crystal a lot, so I wasn't as concerned with that. So that's where I started with the cup, and then I kind of worked back to front, which is probably the traditional way of approaching watercolor, and what I usually do most is paint back to front. And what I mean by that is the objects that are furthest away in the setup, paint them first while masking out the others normally, and then painting closer, 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 also top to bottom. So you know, the blade or the knife will probably be the last things that we tackle, or maybe this guy. The black background will be first, do the picture. That's how I'm going to plan to do this, because there's nothing super crazy that I'm worried about messing up. If this were like a cut crystal plate or something, then, you know, I might want to do that first, and if it's not right, I can start over. So it's important to plan out what you're going to be doing. And for this, I'm going to do my background first. Now, I have friends who paint similar style. They do the black background last. The reason I do it first is because when you put one color down and then you put a darker color next to it, it changes the value of that first color. If I tried to paint this picture just with white, the white background, I would think that I would have all these values correct, and then I would go in and paint the black and realize that no, I wasn't even close. It has to get much darker, because that's just the way that, you know, your eye processes. At least for me, this is the experience that I kind of know how my mind works, and so this is what works for me. Like I said at the beginning, lots of different ways to do it. So figure out what works for you. The downside to painting the background first, obviously, is that once we come back in here, to paint the picture with a wet brush, we're going to have to be really careful not to get too close to our black, or else it's going to bleed in and ruin our nice sharp edge. That takes brush control, and it's something that just comes with practice. You got to put hours into the brush and learn how to have a steady hand and not have that brush go where you don't want it to. So that's the drawback, but for me, the advantage of having that dark value established in the beginning outweighs that drawback. Having that black there, it really helps me to gauge where the other darks and lights in the painting need to be. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we start getting into this. But before we paint the black background, we're going to talk a little bit about masking. So with watercolor, we really want to preserve our whites. We don't want to have to paint over or redo things as much as possible. We want to avoid that because that just causes muddy colors and paper fibers getting all overworked. So keeping everything as clean as we can is one of my goals. The main way of doing this is using masking fluid. I have tried, I don't know, half a dozen different masking fluids. They're all different. You got to find the one that works for you. The three that I would recommend, and what I'm going to be using today is it's a core watercolor product made by Golden, and it is a white fluid, and when it dries white or close to it. There is a Sennelier masking fluid that's also very good, and I've also used PBO. The problem with white is sometimes you think you've put mask down, but you can't really see it. So you might miss something. Sometimes it's hard to tell what you've masked and what you haven't masked. So you'll find companies like Winsor & Newton, they'll make their masking fluid that's slightly off color, be a little creamier so you can sort of see it better on the paper. The PBO is a light bluish gray, and it works really well. It comes off super easy, but the problem that I've noticed is that a small stain, or it's not a residue, but it's just a little discoloration from that bluish grayish color of the masking fluid will remain on the paper. So that's not normally a big deal because you're just going to paint over it, but if you are going to be leaving something like a bright highlight in glass or silver, you don't want that to be discolored. You really want that pure white paper. And so I would encourage using a masking fluid that's not going to stain your paper in those cases. So that's the kind of thing you just got to experiment around and find out what you like. But those are three that are really good that I would recommend. There are some general tips that I want to make sure I go over when it comes to masking because it can be finicky. Excuse me. Basically what you're doing is putting down like a thin layer of latex that's going to block the watercolor from getting onto that part of the paper, and then you're going to peel it off later and have a nice crisp sharp line, which can be good, can be bad. We'll talk about the telltale signs of masking fluid later on. But But it's important to be using fresh masking fluid, something that hasn't been sitting around in your studio for, 6 months or a year. It's important that you have you can kind of smell the ammonia. That's one way to tell that it's fresh. But you want to make sure you're using fresh stuff because it begins to break down and then it becomes really hard to remove. And it should be able to just lift off relatively simply, relatively easily, without damaging the paper fibers. And the older it gets, the you start running into problems. So always use fresh stuff. And because of that, I buy small bottles. I mean, you can get like big bottles of masking fluid, but I don't use it fast enough. And then, I think I'm saving money by buying in bulk, but I'm really not because it'll go bad and I won't use it. So that's one aspect. Another thing is it's really hard on brushes. So you do not want to put one of your nice brushes into the masking fluid. It'll get gummy and it'll dry up in there and it's really hard to get out and it'll destroy a nice brush. So what I do is I have older, beat up brushes that are years old. They don't have a real great point, but I'm not worried about them getting damaged. The other thing you can do is wet your brush beforehand and get lots of soap into the hairs of your brush. And what I use is this is a brush soap made by Escoda. I recommend the Escoda brushes. And basically, getting your brush wet and getting a little soap on there just protects those hairs, and it enables you to rinse out that masking fluid much easier. So you do that and then dip it in. You'll have much more success. The third thing about masking fluid, I know you're like, when is he going to start painting? We're getting there. The third thing about masking is you don't want to water it down at all. Either you're putting your brush right into the bottle, or if you're going to be doing a large area, I'll pour out some fluid into a separate container. You don't want to leave this jar open for a long period of time because then that'll also affect its longevity when that product starts breaking down, exposed to the air. So if you do pour it out into a separate container, make sure your brush isn't loaded up with water or you're not getting soap or anything else into that fluid. If it gets watered down, it's not going to protect as well and it's going to be much harder to get off. The last tip I will say about masking fluid is be careful leaving it on for a long time. It varies brand to brand, but don't just put it on your paper and leave it there for weeks, because it will basically permanently bind to the paper fibers and you're not going to get it off, or it's going to be a giant mess trying to rip it up. So don't leave it on for too long, and if you're the sort of painter that uses a hairdryer, you gotta be real careful not to overheat or burn it, melt it into the paper. So I generally will try to avoid using a hairdryer or not use it on a very hot setting if I've got masking on my paper. Now, I guess you could brush masking over the entire thing, but that just seems like a chore and a real waste of masking fluid. So what I will do is take a sheet of tracing paper and cover up the bulk of what I want to protect with the paper, and then just mask the edges after I tape it down. So I'm going to do that, now so you can see what I mean. I'm just going to draw a rough shape, maybe an inch contracted from my actual contour. So I know it's hard to see pencil marks on white, but my actual outline is here. But what I'm going to do with the tracing, I'm going to cut out about an inch away from that. And you'll see why in a second. This doesn't have to be exact. This is just a rough shape. All right. So that's going to serve to protect that part of the paper. And what I'm going to do is use masking tape. If you ever wondered why it was called that, now you know. It was designed to be used as a mask. And I'm going to tape this down all the way around with tape. And I'm going to try and put the tape as close to these edges as possible, and I'm going to brush mask up to the end, up to the very edge. Unless it's a spot like this, if it's the back ledge or the top where it's a really straight line, then I'll just go ahead and use the edge of the tape to create that line. So right here I'm going to put my tape right up next to my pencil line so that I'm going to have a nice sharp edge to that shelf. And I'll do the same thing on this side. You're going to get a much sharper, straighter line if you use the tape than if you tried to brush that on with masking fluid. Alright, now the rest, those are my three straight line areas. The rest of this, I'm going to try and get the tape up close. And what I will then do is brush the masking on those areas so I get that curve of that pear. Normally in my live workshops, I'll be responding to questions and comments and joking around. So it's a little different to have the quiet. But like I encourage you, I hope you're writing down any questions that you have and we can kind of go over those on our Zoom call. All right, Right now I am burnishing down this tape edge, especially in these straight areas. I don't want any paint going under there. I've seen people that just put tape down and they think that's it. I mean, you gotta like burnish it if you really want to have it stick. One of those things that I just assumed people know until I realized that some people don't. Alright, so masking fluid. This is going to be pretty straightforward. I'm just going to dip my brush right into the jar here. I've wet my brush. I got my Viscoda brush soap here. This stuff works great. It's all, natural oils and oxides, and it works as hand soap as well. And you can use a bar of Dove soap, or now I'm guessing that you're probably not able to see that application really well. Because it is white. If I were using Winsor Newton or the PBO, you would be able to see it much better if you can't. So you can just trust me that it's going on there, and I am basically just brushing this right on up to the outline of my shape, the picture in this case. I try to get it on somewhat thick, a thick application, because I think it helps makes it easier to peel it off when you're done. If it's too thin, I mean, it's not a big deal, but it's not as easy to pull up. And I will leave some parts kind of on the thinner side so that you can see that when we get to that part. So I think I've got all of that covered. But as I said, that's kind of the drawback of using a pure white mask. It's hard to tell sometimes. So right now I am just rinsing out in water, again, because the masking fluid can really do a number on your brush. So cleaning it out frequently will help, and then just start the process over. I am left-handed, so I am moving from the right side to the left side. If you're right-handed, do it the opposite way. That way you're not putting your hand or your wrist down into your wet mask. Try to make your strokes long and fluid. You know, we're not going to want to have choppy edges when we peel this up, so some of that we can fix. Don't stress about it, but you don't want to just kind of do like that. And I'm looking at my reference photo, and this little pear slice has that little hole where a seed used to be, and that's going to show through the black, so I'm going to paint around that. Is my big old head getting in the camera? I think I'm alright. That would not be good if we shot the whole thing and you couldn't see anything that I was doing. Alright, so that's that. Clean your brush out real good. Real well, I should say. And just give it a look to make sure there's no clumps in there, but there shouldn't be. Alright, now I need to let that dry fully before we do anything else. So let's see, in the meantime, I'll talk a little bit about my palette and the rest of my setup. So we went over the towel. Here's my, I'll do it this way. This is kind of how it ends up looking, and I just kind of leave these center wells messy. I can come back in for another painting and just, you know, mix this slop together and really get some great grays from the color that's just left over. So I left that on there so that you guys could just kind of see how my palette will look at the end of a week of painting. But I'll clean it up so that you have a real good idea of what colors I'm mixing when we get to that class. In the meantime, this palette is my standard or my go-to palette. It is made out of porcelain, so it's got some weight to it. You know, I got young kids at home and I have a open studio policy, so they come in to see what daddy's doing, and sometimes they'll bang the table or, you know, knock my arm. But this palette, it's not going anywhere. It's also, because it's porcelain, really easy to clean. Costs a little bit more because of the weight and the porcelain, but I've had a number of plastic palettes, and there are certain colors especially that really can stain a plastic palette. If it's, you know, any of the phthalo blue or phthalo green especially, I found they just really can get in there, and you can't get that white back. Whereas with this porcelain, it cleans up really well. That's just kind of thing you try out over time and figure out what you like, what works for you. It's not a travel palette, but it's what I use in my studio. As far as your color setup, I encourage students to squeeze out a generous amount of color into your wells and leave it there so that you have kind of a repeating knowledge of where everything is like that. It's almost like muscle memory. You'll know, boom, I need ultramarine, and you'll know right there that's where it is. As opposed to sometimes I see people just put out like little dots, and I'll do that too, but that's not, you want to have your wells set up so that you know where everything is and you can just hit it fast, especially if you're working on a wash where it's drying at a certain rate. You want to be able to just get the color you want and mix up what you need quickly. So there's lots of different theories on how to, set your palette up, what colors are in your palette. It's all a very personal thing. There's not a right or a wrong, really. So again, I'm just telling you what I do, and you can take it for what it's worth. Basically, I've got mine divided up into warm and cool. Depending on how meticulous you want to be, you can even go further and divide your cool section into a warm cool and a cool. And the same thing with your warmer side. You can have a warm color that's also leans cooler. But what I have here is my earth tones over here, and my warms going around to my cool blues and greens over here. Occasionally I am trying out new colors, and so that's kind of what I'll use these corners for sometimes, as if I'm experimenting with something that might be maybe relevant to the painting I'm working on right now, or I'm getting fed up with a certain color or the properties and I want to try out another. Like right now, this junk right here I got to get rid of because I'm not. This is raw sienna. It's just ugh. Or let's see, over here is another example. I have cerulean and manganese blue. I go back and forth. As soon as I think, this is the one I really like, and then I change my mind. So that's kind of you don't need to have both of those. What else? When we get to the class where we're actually doing the painting, I'll squeeze out some in here, and when I start each day, I've got a little spritzer bottle that I can go around and moisten all of those. Or if I don't need all the colors, I can use this eyedropper. Just drop in, like I'm going to be working on that, and wet that up. The paint pigments that I recommended for this class, you have that list. I tried to keep it scaled down so that you don't have to buy every color that I have on my palette. It should be enough to do what we're doing with our painting. If you have questions, and there's always questions about paints and pigments and manufacturers. Happy to get into that deep dive when we talk, so let me know. So now I'm looking at my mask. It's all almost completely dry. So our next session, we're going to actually start painting. So thank you for your patience. We got up to this place, kind of just laying the groundwork. It's all really important that we don't just start flinging paint right away. For this style of work, I have lots of friends who are, plein air painters, or they just can start going. But my realistic style requires a lot of planning, so that's a lot of what this first class was about. So thanks for sticking with me. Our next class, I'm going to talk about how I mix my black. It's a custom black, and that's probably the question I get asked the most. So how do you get that black look in the background? So that's going to be our main focus next time. So thank you, and I look forward to talking with you all. Bring your questions, and it'll be a fun time where we can actually interact. So I'm looking forward to that. Thanks, everybody.